This is a Pulp Archive recording. All public Pulp Archive recordings are licensed under Creative Commons. For more information or to support us, please visit patreon.com/pulparchive. This episode was prepared by Soul and narrated by Goodman, the digital narrator. The Brand of Cain by Ward Sterling. The Black Mask, April 1922. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. Dr. Andrews, the physician who had been called in by the coroner, gave as his opinion that Waldo Fellows had met death shortly after midnight. The condition of the body, he said, proved his contention. Then, too, the fact that the blood with which the sheets were smeared had dried and hardened caused him to stick to his statement. Yet, Orville Hitchens, Fellows' secretary, swore that his employer had been alive and well at 2 o'clock in the morning. Hitchens stated that he had been summoned by Fellows at 1 o'clock and requested to drive to Amboy, 2 miles away, for some bromide. Mr. Fellows had been extremely nervous of late and found himself unable to sleep. Finding that he had no bromide, a drug that he was accustomed to taking, he had awakened the secretary. Hitchens asserted that he had taken the light car, made the trip, and returned just before the clock struck 2. Fellows had taken a dose of the drug and Hitchens had again retired. Henry Phelps, the drug clerk, verified Hitchens' statement as to the purchase of the bromide, while Londies, the chauffeur, told of getting out the light car for the secretary who had driven it himself. In spite of this, Dr. Andrews stuck to his statement that the murdered man had been dead at least 10 hours when he made his examination. Swenson, the valet, had discovered the murder when he went to awaken his master at 8 o'clock. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Coroner Stevenson arrived, accompanied by Dr. Andrews and Bram Dwyer, the New York detective, who, with myself, was spending a few days' vacation in the little village. The prominence of the murdered man, coupled with the fact that the detective and Stevenson were old friends, caused the New Yorker to interest himself in the case at the latter's request. Fellows was a gentleman farmer, a man worth several millions of dollars made in Wall Street, who, tired of life in the city, had purchased Samoset Farm just at the edge of Amboy Township, and, after stocking it with the finest blooded cattle and horses that money could buy, had settled down to a life of rustic bliss. As time passed, he had added to his acreage by purchasing adjoining farms until half the township was his. He had erected a mansion around which he had built smaller homes for his employees. These, with the great barns, sheds for the machinery, dairy, and offices, made Samoset Farm almost a small town. Such a man as Waldo Fellows, set down in the midst of a rural community, is bound to be sought out by his fellow men. Twice he had reluctantly allowed himself to represent his district in the state legislature. The governor's chair could have been his for the asking. His fellow townsmen loved him for the nobility of his character, yet he had enemies by the score, many of them the small landowners whose farms surrounded his. For the man who does things on a big scale is certain, sooner or later, to tramp on the toes of others. But who among those he had offended hated him to the extent of taking his life? 2 Fellows was murdered in bed, apparently in cold blood, for there was no evidence of a struggle of any kind. Nothing in the room had been disturbed, so far as could be ascertained. Nothing of value had been taken. The fact that the bedding was not mussed led to the belief that the murderer had struck while his victim was asleep. None of the servants, nor Mrs. Fellows, who slept just across the hall, had heard any noise, save when Hitchens returned from the drugstore with the drug which Fellows had requested. Mrs. Fellows had called over the transom to Hitchens to ask what was the matter, and he had told her of his employer's sleeplessness. The bottle of bromide, with a small quantity gone, was found on the table beside the bed. Bromide seldom acts inside of half to 3/4 of an hour. Hence, assuming that Hitchens had told the truth, and everything pointed to his having done so, Fellows must, if he was killed in his sleep, have met death not earlier than 3 o'clock. Yet the blood which had flowed from the wound, the condition of the body, everything, led a cool conservative medical man to declare that death had struck at least 3 hours earlier. Nor could his testimony be shaken. There were 12 servants who slept in the house, all occupying the upper floor, with the exception of Hitchens, Marie, Mrs. Fellow's maid, and Swenson, the valet. Watson, the butler, and general man about the house, was the last person to bed, and, according to his own statement, the first up in the morning. He had personally locked all the doors and windows on the first floor. They were all locked when he made his rounds in the morning. Hitchens, in going to the drugstore, had left the house by the side door. This he had left unlocked, relocking it upon his return. This led to the assumption on the part of some of the officials that the murderer had entered the place by that door during the secretary's absence, hiding until his return, and after Fellows was asleep, had struck the fatal blow and escaped by the same door, springing the lock after him. There was no other way of looking at the matter unless one went on the theory that the deed had been committed by one of the servants or Mrs. Fellows, and the latter was unthinkable. While the servants, all of them, had been in Fellows' employ for years and were known to be absolutely loyal. Of course, the windows of the sleeping rooms on the second floor were open. A man of agility might have gained an entrance in this way. But luckily there had been a slight rainfall earlier in the evening, and as a result the ground was in a condition to take impressions easily. The coroner and the sheriff made a thorough search for marks of a ladder or footprints, but were positive that there was none beneath any of the windows. And there was always to be considered the lack of motive. Aside from the farmers who were jealous of the big landowner, there was no one known to hold a grudge against him. My friend Dwyer declined to assist the officials in their hunt for footprints, contenting himself with dawdling about the house as if greatly bored with the whole affair. Conversant as I am with his methods, I admit that this surprised me, for he is usually energy personified when there is some perplexing problem to be untangled. Eventually, however, the officials, nonplussed, were forced to turn to him for advice. He answered with a shrug of his shoulders, absolutely refusing to be drawn into a discussion of the case. Following the time-worn methods, the sheriff called all of the servants together and examined them, eliciting no more information than had already been gained. It was at this point that Dwyer, who had listened to the questioning without comment, offered a suggestion. "There is a band of gypsies camped a few miles the other side of town," he remarked quietly. "Their chief is old Father Lipke, a friend of mine. The old fellow knows his business from the ground up, fortune-telling, mind-reading, and all of that sort of stuff. In fact, he's assisted me on more than one occasion. I know that you'll laugh at me for the suggestion, but let me bring him here. I'll guarantee that he'll have the murderer by the heels inside of half an hour. How he does it I don't pretend to know. It's positively uncanny, the way he pulls off his stunts. But if it's results you want, then Lipke is your man," the sheriff sneered. Coroner Stevenson, in spite of his friendship for the detective, suppressed a smile with difficulty. "You don't want us to think that you believe in such rot, do you, Bram?" he inquired. My friend shrugged his shoulders again. "You asked for my opinion," he answered. "I am giving it to you. I'll take a chance on Father Lipke. In fact, as I have stated, I have many a time. The man has powers beyond the understanding of men like us, but of course it's up to you and the sheriff." 3 darkness had fallen when Dwyer and the coroner again drove up to the fellow's home, accompanied by Father Lipke the gypsy. A typical member of his race was Lipke, a wrinkled little figure far past the age allotted to man. But in spite of his years, he carried himself like a youth of 20, and his black, beady eyes glittered like those of a boy, as he prepared the stage for the affair, his huge brass earrings rattling like castanets as he hurried here and there. The spot selected by the coroner upon the advice of Dwyer for the test of Lipke's powers was the huge living room on the lower floor. The servants were ordered to carry out all of the furniture, with the exception of the chairs, which were arranged along the wall. Then every member of the household, with the exception of the widow, was ordered to be present, the old man, mumbling to himself, drew a large circle on the floor in the center of the room with a piece of charcoal. After which he commanded us to seat ourselves just outside the circular mark, warning us under penalty of death not to enter the circle unless commanded to do so by him. His next act was to produce a brazier, which he lighted and placed in the center of the circle. By its side he placed a small vessel containing water. The lights were then turned out. For an instant we were in darkness. Then the brazier flamed up, filling the room with an unearthly bluish, greenish sort of glare. Chanting to himself, the old man threw a pinch of powder into the flames at intervals. The light would turn for a second into a vivid red, then die away again to the dull, sickly bluish green. Suddenly he seated himself cross-legged at the side of the brazier and bowed his head, closing his eyes as if in prayer. He mumbled to himself in an unintelligible jargon. I confessed to a feeling of nervousness. I could tell from the expression on their faces that the others were the same. The tension was becoming almost unbearable when the old man slowly raised himself to a standing position and, seizing the vessel of water, sprinkled it on the floor inside the circle, being extremely careful that not a single drop fell outside the mark. I must protect you from the powers of evil, he explained, keeping carefully inside the mark. He made the rounds, touching each of us lightly on the forehead, making on each of us the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, I heard him mumble to himself. Reseating himself on the floor, he again bowed his head, and once more his lips moved as if in prayer. Suddenly he fell over, and for several minutes writhed about as if in terrific pain. I leaped to my feet to assist him, but the strong hand of Bram Dwyer held me back. Remember, he shouted, the old man commanded us, regardless of what happened, not to cross the line. After 3 or 4 minutes, the spasms ceased, and the gypsy, seemingly none the worse for his experience, arose and addressed us. My friends, he commenced in his halting, broken English, you have asked me here to use my arts in the detection of one who has committed a crime, the crime of murder. I have done my best. Inside this circle, have I wrestled with the powers of darkness and the spirits of light? I know not which one of you committed this foul deed. No one knows save God. Yet he who created all things will not allow the crime of murder to pass unnoticed. Therefore, I say unto you this, if he who committed this crime is in this room, there will appear upon his forehead the sign of the cross, the mark that God placed upon Cain. This alone can I do more than that I am not allowed, for my powers are limited. He signaled for Dwyer to turn on the lights. An instant later we were blinking at the unaccustomed brightness. The old man seized the brazier and held it close to the face of each of us, gazing into our eyes as if seeking to read there the secret he was bent upon obtaining. Then came a shriek, a gasp of astonishment, of horror, a cry. I turned my head, my eyes following the gaze of the others. Upon the forehead of Hitchens was the sign of the cross. For a second there was silence, cold, oppressive silence. The secretary gazed from one to another of us, mutely, questioningly. Then his eyes sought the mirror above the fireplace. Afterward, I recalled that Dwyer had seated him in front of the glass. His face became drawn. The sweat stood out on his forehead in great beads. Slowly, as if stunned, his fingers sought the accursed mark upon his forehead. He spat upon his hand and rubbed the spittle across the spot as if to erase it. He held the tips of his fingers in front of his eyes, surveying them thoughtfully, dazed. Then, without warning, he dropped to his knees, his arms outstretched towards the swarthy man within the circle. I did it! Jay did it! He shrieked. 4. No, I never met Lipke until yesterday. Dwyer chuckled to us as, 2 hours later, Hitchens safely lodged in jail. He sat with the coroner, the sheriff, and myself in the former's parlor, and went over the various phases of the case. I am a fairly good judge of character, and when I noticed him begging on Main Street yesterday, I immediately placed the old fellow as being far above the average of his class mentally, and capable of playing almost any part he might be called upon to take. I realize far better than the rest of you that the murderer was too clever to be captured unless some subterfuge was used, and when you appealed to me, Stevenson, my thoughts reverted at once to the old man. A falsehood or two in the interests of justice is, in my opinion, perfectly allowable, and that I was correct in my estimate is proved by what happened. What appealed to me from the very start was the apparent lack of motive. Had we been able to supply a motive, we might have been able to have laid our hands on the man who struck the blow. But in the absence of one, it became necessary to take some radical step. To imagine that one of the farmers hereabouts would become jealous enough to strike fellows down was absurd. And granting that some of them might have the nerve, they lacked the imagination to pull off so mysterious a crime. I was confident in my own mind that Hitchens was the guilty party. Why? Because he was the only man who had an opportunity to kill fellows. But on the other hand, his frank statements apparently eliminated him from the suspects. Let us analyze the affair a trifle deeper. Dr. Andrews swears that Fellows was killed shortly after midnight. We now know that he was correct. But Hitchens bobs up with the story of being in conversation with the murdered man. At 2 o'clock, he was able to prove his statements by 2 reputable and disinterested witnesses, Landais the chauffeur and Phelps the drug clerk. Therefore, my conclusion was that either Hitchens was lying or that the physician was wrong. But my experience has taught me that medical men are, as a general rule, cold-blooded, that is, they figure things out with mathematical accuracy, and by the law of averages they are right 99 times out of 100. Therefore Hitchens was lying, but so far as we knew, there was no motive. Now the average man has deep within him a streak of superstition and a fear of whatever he does not understand. Therefore, I took the indolent attitude before the servants, finally working things up to a climax, so that they expected wonderful things. From the gypsy whom I had touted so highly, as soon as you gave your permission, I hunted up the old man, whose name, by the way, is not Lipke but Roderigo. For $10 he agreed to play the part the way I told him to, and that he sustained my estimate of him. I believe you will all agree, I spent the afternoon in coaching him. I felt that, in case Hitchens did not confess, we would have lost nothing. But I was betting on the superstitious streak in his makeup and won out. We all know now what his motive was. He had been systematically robbing his employer for years. Fellows had become suspicious, and last night notified the secretary that they would go over the books together today. Hitchens waited until his employer was sleeping, then entered the room by means of a key that he had secured possession of, struck the fatal blow, then went through the mummery of going to the village after the bromide, thus providing himself with an almost perfect alibi. With Fellows dead, he figured that as confidential man, he would be retained for a year or two to come, finally reaching a point where he could get his hands on a large sum of money and make his escape before his defalcations were discovered. But, rumbled the sheriff, I am still in the dark as to how the gypsy caused that black cross to appear on his forehead just by mumbling a few prayers. Those people know a lot of black art that we more civilized people will never be able to understand. Dwyer grinned. I furnished the black art myself, he answered. It cost me 10 cents at the drugstore. The old man made the cross on Hitchens' forehead first, if you will recall the affair. He had just dipped his hand into the vessel of what looked like water. He only pretended to dip his hand into it when he anointed the rest of you. The heat of the brazier brought out the mark, or started it. When he held it up and pretended to peer into your faces, what was it? Merely a 10% solution of ammonium chloride, the same stuff from which invisible ink is made. The old man's skin being dark, it didn't come out on his hand as it did on Hitchens' forehead. And that's the whole story. End of The Brand of Cain by Ward Sterling. The Man Who Was Two by Harold Ward. The Black Mask, April 1922. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. To the governor and members of the Board of Pardons some 6 years ago, according to the Daily Press, Captain John Connors of the Detective Bureau of the New York City Police Department was killed in a wreck of the Oskaloosa Limited between Chicago, Illinois, and Clinton, Iowa. His body, horribly mangled and disfigured beyond recognition, was shipped home, where it was buried with all the honors due a man of his position. In view of the fact that his was the only body not positively identified, together with the further fact that he was a personal friend of the conductor, one James Barley, who testified at the inquest that he had talked with Connors not over 5 minutes before the wreck, his family and friends accepted the remains without question. I alone know the true story of John Connors. I am making this statement in the hope that a great wrong may be righted. 2. Captain John Connors had been in the West in search of a gang of forgers who had made New York their headquarters. Failing to locate his men, he was on his way home when a telegram intercepted him at Denver, asking him to keep an eye open for one Simon Latham wanted in New York for murder. Latham, known throughout the country as a gunman and gangster, had, according to the telegram, committed a crime of unusual atrocity, killing 2 policemen in cold blood and making his escape unscathed. He was believed to have gone to Denver, where he was known to have friends. Connors, being well acquainted with him, was asked to stop over in the Colorado City to assist the police in their search. 2 days spent in Denver convinced him that there was nothing to be gained by a longer stay. The second day out of the western metropolis, he was passing through the train on his way to the observation car when he suddenly located his quarry slumped down in a seat in the smoking compartment. In spite of the fact that Latham had disguised himself to the best of his ability, by growing a stubby beard and donning smoked glasses, Connors had no trouble in recognizing him. Latham was alone in the compartment at the time. Before he had time to make a move, Connors had him covered. "Up with your hands, Latham," he commanded. The gunman obeyed the order. "Who do you think I am, damn ya?" he snarled. Connors smiled. "I don't think I know," he answered. "You are." He was interrupted by a crash. His revolver flew from his hand as he pitched forward into the arms of the man he had arrested. An instant later, both men were hurried across the car and buried under a mass of debris. Then hell broke loose. The wrecked train was enveloped in flames. Clouds of scalding steam drove the rescuers back. Time after time, the air was filled with the shrieks of the wounded and the groans of the dying. Men worked like demons to save those who were buried beneath the burning wreckage. Connors and Latham, hidden under the debris of 2 cars, were among the last to be found. The body of the policeman was little more than a charred mass of flesh. Under him, yet protected to a certain extent by his form, was Simon Latham. He too had suffered terrible injuries, yet within his shell still lingered the breath of life. As they dragged the form of the murderer from beneath the wreckage, even the hardened physicians and volunteer nurses gasped with astonishment that he still lived. His face had been parboiled by the scalding steam until the flesh hung in strips. His body, from which the clothes had been burned, was a solid mass of burns. Swathed in cotton, saturated with oil, they rushed him to the hospital. A week passed. He remained unidentified. After a month, he took a slight turn for the better. Finally, he was able to speak a few words. Physicians and nurses gathered around his bed and asked him to identify himself. He answered them listlessly, seemingly as a child repeats a lesson. He was Simon Latham, gunman, gangster, murderer. He was wanted in New York, he told them, for the killing of 2 policemen. Captain Connors had been about to arrest him when the wreck intervened. They expected him to die. It was an impossibility, said the physicians, for a man in his condition to continue living. They believed that he realized it and was making a deathbed confession. They summoned a priest to the Holy Father. He repeated the same story. And then he got well as a man can get who has passed through hell. The New York police were notified. When he left the hospital, it was with handcuffs on his wrists, yet he made no resistance. His spirit was broken. He reiterated his confession, denying nothing, admitting everything. The state furnished him with an attorney. Acting on the lawyer's advice, he threw himself on the mercy of the court. A kind-hearted judge, taking his physical condition into consideration, sentenced him to life imprisonment rather than the chair. 3. Simon Latham became a model prisoner. He went about his appointed tasks in a solemn, mechanical sort of way. A broken-down old man scarcely out of his teens, a man whose face was seamed with myriad scars, twisted and contorted out of shape by muscular contraction. His short cropped hair was snow white, his form bent and feeble. In his eyes was a far-away look, the look of a dog that has lost its master. Eventually, he was made a trustee. He performed his work with a servility that surprised those who had known him in former years. Everyone remembers the prison break of some weeks ago. 500 men, the dregs of civilization, armed with a miscellaneous collection of weapons garnered from God knows where, threw themselves against the little group of guards in the big dining hall. For 2 hours the battle waged to and fro. Eventually the officials, better armed, better disciplined, won out. Yet the victory was not gained without considerable loss. As is always the case, many of the prisoners aligned themselves on the side of law and order. Among them was Simon Latham, the lifer. When the trouble broke loose, Latham was standing midway between the row of prisoners and the little knot of guards. As the missiles flew through the air, he was caught between 2 fires. Something, a dish or bowl, struck him squarely on the head. He dropped to the floor unconscious. For 5 minutes the battle waged across his body. Then he recovered consciousness and plunged into the fray with almost maniacal strength, aiding the guards wherever possible. When the affair was ended and the mutineers were finally herded back into their cells, he was bleeding from a dozen wounds. Here is the peculiar feature. Immediately after the fight, Latham, the model prisoner, became a prison outlaw. He refused to obey prison discipline, insisted on hobnobbing with the guards, and attempted to escape whenever occasion offered itself. He was taken before the warden. The latter, who had taken a great interest in the case of the former gunman, especially since his services at the time of the break, tried argument. Latham insisted to the warden that he was being unjustly held. He asserted that he was not Simon Latham, the outlaw, but Captain John Connors, the policeman. The warden, a man not prone to forget favors, finally ordered him taken from the cell where he had been confined after his outbreak and placed in the insane ward under observation. He is there now. Here are the facts as I deduce them. I am positive that I am right. Captain Connors was in the act of arresting Latham when the wreck occurred. He had, as I have said, drawn his revolver and with it covered the murderer. "Who do you think I am, damn ya?" the gangster demanded. "I don't think I know," Connors answered. "You are." Before he could finish his sentence, the cars were piled together, he was thrown forward, and received a terrific blow on the head. Then and there all memory disappeared, but in his subconscious mind were the thoughts that had been flashing through his brain while Lai was making the arrest. His subconscious memory retained nothing but the impressions of Simon Latham. He had known Latham for years. His history was, to the policeman, an open book. He was about to utter Latham's name when the blow came that erased all memory. So while the conscious mind of Captain John Connors was obliterated, there remained in the tiny cells in the back of his head the recollection of the man who stood before him at that last instant. Latham was killed. His body, mutilated beyond all recognition, was buried as Captain John Connors. Connors, disfigured and mutilated, speaking only the thoughts that, as I have said, were in his mind at that last instant, thoughts that had only to do with Simon Latham. Accepted the role of Simon Latham, lived it, accepted the punishment of Simon Latham. Yet somewhere in those tiny cells of subconsciousness remained the policeman. He could not be the renegade that Latham had been, because it was not in his makeup, even though in his own mind he was Latham. Why? Because his training had all been on the side of law and order. Then came the prison break, that flying dish, striking him on the head, removed in some way the pressure against his brain. Immediately, the role of Simon Latham was forgotten, and he started in again where he had left off 6 years before. He was again Captain Connors, policeman and guardian of the law. As Captain John Connors, he plunged into the fight against the convicts. I am positive, gentlemen, that I am right. I ask that you allow me to return home to my family and friends. For your excellency and gentlemen of the Board of Pardons, I am Captain John Connors. I trust that you will accept my word. I have no other proof. End of The Man Who Was Two by Harold Ward. Thank you so much for hanging out today. My name is Saul, and this is the Pulp Archive. Now, if you had fun, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, comment, and share. That stuff really helps. And like most stories we cover here, today's was recommended by you. So, if there's a story you'd like to see, send us an email at pulparchivelibrary@gmail.com. We'd love to cover it. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep us going, consider subscribing to our Apple channel or becoming a member on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/pulparchive. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get access to all our podcasts and private explicit episodes that wouldn't be allowed publicly. We feature almost every genre of pulp fiction: horror, detective, western, and even sports. Special thanks to our patrons who make the podcast possible and make every episode of the Pulp Archive happen. Every episode is dedicated to our Patreon members. I truly could not do this without you.